All right, let's talk about the hidden architects of our financial world, the actuaries. These are the folks who make it possible for companies to make financial promises that last for decades. But how do they actually do it? Let's pull back the curtain and see what's really going on. I mean, just think about that for a second. A company promises you something today that they have to deliver on 50 years from now. That's half a century of potential market crashes, crazy inflation, not to mention people living way longer than anyone ever expected. How can anyone possibly make a promise like that with any real confidence? Well, this is the exact challenge that actuaries exist to solve. You know, the world is just full of financial uncertainty. And over long stretches of time, what seems like a small risk can balloon into a massive, company-breaking problem. So the first thing actuaries do is get really specific about identifying and measuring these uncertainties. Okay, first up is something called longevity risk. It's a fancy term for a pretty simple and kind of scary idea. The risk that you live longer than you planned for and your retirement savings just run out. Now, for a company paying a pension for life, this is a huge, huge financial threat. They've promised to pay you no matter how long you live. Then we've got investment risk. The money that's set aside for your future pension doesn't just sit in a box, right? It's out there, invested in the markets. But we all know markets are volatile. A major crash can just wipe out a huge chunk of those funds, leaving a massive gap between what was promised and what's actually there. And finally, there's insurance risk. This is the risk of those big, unpredictable black swan events. We're talking about a massive hurricane, a devastating earthquake, or even a global pandemic. These things can cause a flood of claims to come in all at once, putting unbelievable financial pressure on insurers. So, faced with all this chaos and uncertainty, how do you build systems that don't just collapse under the pressure? This is where actuaries bring out their special blueprint for managing risk. It's all about turning that chaos into a structured, manageable plan. So, what is an actuary, really? At its core, it's a professional who uses a powerful mix of math, statistics, and financial theory to tackle the unknown. But they don't just try to predict the future with a crystal ball. They design products and systems that are tough enough, resilient enough to actually withstand it. And the absolute heart of their work is this powerful framework called the actuarial control cycle. You gotta understand, this isn't just a one-and-done calculation. It's a continuous, living loop for managing risk over the long haul. Let's break down how it actually works. The cycle really has 3 key stages. First, you specify the problem. You have to be crystal clear. What risks are we actually trying to manage here? Second, you develop the solution. This is where you design the product, figure out the pricing, and set up a funding strategy. And third, and this is so important, you monitor the experience. You watch what's happening in the real world and you compare it to what you assumed would happen. Then you feed that information right back into the process to make the solution better. It's a constant cycle of learning and adapting. So with this blueprint in hand, actuaries can start to build the complex financial products that so many of us rely on every single day. Let's see what this looks like in the real world. Let's go back to pensions. In what's called a defined benefit plan, the actuary designs it so your employer takes on the longevity and investment risk. They promise you a set income in retirement, and it's on them to make sure the money's there. But in a defined contribution plan, the tables are turned. You take on those risks. What you get in the end depends entirely on your contributions and how your investments do. It's a perfect example of how actuarial design is really about allocating risk in very specific and intentional ways. And the scope of their work is just massive. It's everywhere. From the price you pay for your car insurance to the stability of your pension fund, actuarial design is working behind the scenes. The core idea is always the same. If a product is making a financial promise about an uncertain future, you can bet an actuary designed the structure that makes it possible. And the level of detail they have to master is just immense. Now, don't worry about all the jargon here. This is an actual question from a professional actuarial exam. It just goes to show you that to qualify, an actuary has to know the incredibly intricate ways that risk and profit can be sliced, diced, and shared. This isn't just about big ideas. It's about being incredibly precise with the details. Remember that third step of the control cycle? Monitor the experience. This is absolutely critical. The job isn't over once a product is launched. Not even close. Actuaries are constantly watching, analyzing, and adapting to a world that, as we know, never, ever stops changing.
And of course, they don't do this in a bubble. They work within a really strict regulatory framework that's designed to keep the entire financial system stable. The goals of regulation are pretty clear: protect consumers, maintain confidence in the system, and keep markets running efficiently. And actuaries play a huge role in making sure their companies are meeting all these complex rules.
And today's actuaries don't just look at one risk at a time in isolation. They use a much bigger picture approach called enterprise risk management. The whole idea is to see how all the different risks a company faces, everything from market downturns to hurricanes, all interact with each other. Because sometimes these risks can actually help cancel each other out, which makes the whole system safer.
And this is such a vital point. The goal is not just to avoid risk. No way. As this source material puts it so well, the goal is to understand risk, to price it correctly, and to intelligently take it on. At the end of the day, taking on calculated risk is the business model of insurance. The goal isn't to eliminate risk, but to manage it for profit.
So all of this leaves us with a really big question. The fundamental principles, like that actuarial control cycle, they're timeless, they work. But the risks themselves, they're constantly evolving. So as our world faces new, complex challenges like climate change and massive cyber attacks, how will these architects of financial security have to adapt their blueprints to build the products that are going to protect all of us tomorrow?